There are two core types of motivation. One is approach, where you're pursuing something you want, and the other is avoid, where you're trying to stop something that you don't want. You're avoiding something from happening. And approach motivation is a lot better. And this actually is true of addictions as well. Rather than trying to stop an addiction, if you've got an addiction, you actually just want to spend your time approaching a goal that you want, approaching your future self. If you spent time approaching the thing that you wanted, eventually your desires would change and you'd stop wanting the thing you don't. But if you spend all your time trying to avoid or stop yourself from doing something you don't want, you're going to actually create more and more of that thing because what you focus on expands. That's the craziest thing about this is if you want something, focus your mind upon the thing you want and spend your energy approaching that thing. If you're spending all of your time avoiding something, then you're ultimately distracting yourself. And this is also true of media. So when you're looking at media, it's either approach-oriented or it's avoid-oriented. If you're using media in a healthy way, you're using it in an approach way. You're using media, for example, to help you achieve your goals. You're reading books, or you're looking up articles, or you're watching videos that ultimately help you to become your future self. That is an approach orientation to media. But think about yourself for a minute. How much media do you consume in an avoid way? And this is where you're actually consuming media to distract yourself because you're avoiding work, or you're avoiding getting focused on that thing. That's what I want you to think about is this approach media or is this avoid media? Even this video, maybe you're watching this because you're trying to avoid focusing on something. You're trying to avoid, your work, or you're just distracting yourself from a minute. And so that's avoid orienting. You're actually just doing an activity to avoid something else. And that's not what you want. When it comes to media and when it comes to knowledge and learning and consuming, you want your consumption to be approach focused. You want your consumption to be things that will help you get where you want to go. You want to actually be studying with a purpose. That's why there's a big difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom. You can have a lot of information, but you might have consumed that information because you were distracting yourself trying to avoid ultimately what you should have been doing. Whereas if you develop knowledge, it's because you're seeking knowledge so that you can actually apply it. There's a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge or even information, but they don't necessarily know how to use it because they're not seeking the knowledge that's ultimately going to help them get there. You want the knowledge you get to be active. You want to have very clear, specific future self, future goals, and you want to be spending your time approaching and seeking knowledge and information and experiences that will help you develop that. There's actually a great deal of research on the subject of high hope people versus low hope people. And one of the core differences is that high hope people proactively spend time seeking knowledge, information, experiences that will help them achieve their goals. Whereas low hope people actually seek information that justifies their not having hope. So for example, that would be maybe watching mainstream news or just watching things that ultimately distract them. They want to feel justified not having hope. And so when you're approach focused, when you're clear on your goals and you're actually spending time and energy getting the knowledge, information, resources to help you advance, to develop your skills, your knowledge, your capabilities, then you're actually using your time well. Then you're actually clear on your goals and you're seeking the information, the knowledge to ultimately enable you to become your future self. One of the things that Ryan Holiday, the author who speaks a lot about Stoicism, talks about, he talks a lot about the difference between alive time and dead time. When you're using alive time, you're actually trying to do what you want to do. You're actually living. You're being intentional. You're being purposeful. Whereas dead time is where you're ultimately inactive. You're reactive. You're distracted. And so if you're seeking knowledge, media, or information simply to avoid something else, that's probably dead time. That's you wasting time. That's you zoning out or distracting yourself or numbing yourself, which is what we do so much, and what so much of the internet and the world is designed around is distraction and dead time. And if you spend hours a day on dead time, watching just TV, watching the news, scrolling Facebook, all of those things are dead time. And the more dead time you have and the more avoid orientation you have towards life, the smaller your future self becomes. Because what you're doing right now is ultimately creating your future self. And so the more alive time you have where you're proactive, you're focused on learning or growing in a specific way. It's not about just learning randomized stuff. It's actually you have a clear goal, a clear future self, and you're seeking the information that will enable you to ultimately do that. Which actually the reason you're seeking that information is so that you can actually stop doing things the way you currently do them and start doing them the way your future self would do them. Because if your future self is up here and your current self is here, then the knowledge, the skills, the capabilities, the confidence that you have to develop to get there, that you have to learn a new way of living. Just like if you're making six figures, in order to make seven figures, you have to learn a new way of living. You have to have a new identity, a new set of habits, a new set of knowledge, a new way of doing things. And so that's why you would seek that knowledge, is ultimately to weed out, let's just call it, your current self habits and behaviors to create your future self identity, habits, and behaviors. And that's what high hope people do. They're willing to adjust how they approach things. They know that maybe the way I've been doing things will get me here, but what got me here won't get me there. Maybe in order to learn these things, I've got to learn new mindsets, new skills, new strategies. And so how much of your time is alive time versus dead time? How much of your media consumption is approach motivated versus avoid motivated? If you're just consuming to avoid life or to avoid work or to distract yourself, that's a lot of dead time. And the more dead time you have, the smaller your future self will be. And the more alive time you have, the more you're actually living as your future self, the more you're creating your future self. So that is the challenge that I have for you, is when you actually seek out media, make sure it's approach focused. Make sure it's the thing you actually want to learn, the thing you're curious about, the thing you're fascinated about, the thing you want to get better at. And when it comes to, let's just say, weeding out a bad habit or overcoming an addiction or changing something, it's far easier to approach what you really want than trying to avoid what you don't. So rather than trying to overcome that addiction, rather than trying to stop something or delete something, the best thing you could do is actually focus purely on the thing you want and take action towards that, because as you start taking action towards that thing you want, a few things happen. Number one, your identity changes. You start to fully identify with the thing you want. The more you engage in it, the more you identify with it, the more you want it. And so your identity will shift from you being, for example, an addict or whatever it is that your former self was. You stop identifying with that because you start identifying with the thing you really want, the thing you're focused on, the thing you're engaging in, the thing you're behaving towards. And so behavior change and even identity change, and also just overcoming bad habits or addictions, you're much better targeting your energy towards what you want and taking action towards what you want and filling your time, your focus, and approaching what you want rather than avoiding what you don't. Because as you pursue that thing, your identity changes, which then you'll stop identifying with who you were before, but also your desires change. It's just like eating, for example. If you start running and you start working out, you'll start to want to eat more. You'll stop wanting the bad food over time. And so your desires will change. If you start focusing on what you want and taking action and taking steps towards what you want, your desires for the things that are holding you back will slightly fade away. They'll stop being interesting to you because you just don't want them anymore. You don't identify with them, and you recognize that they're stopping you from having that thing you really want. That's why focusing on what you want and taking action towards what you really want ripples into not only wanting more of it, but creating more of it. This could be true of exercise. It's also true of, for example, finances and investing. You get really clear on what you want, and then you start taking approach media. You start studying the stock market or studying money or studying motivation or mindset. And over time, that leads you to wanting more of that, to taking bigger and bolder actions towards that. It takes you through that courage cycle. Dan Sullivan actually talks about the 4 C's, which in my opinion is the simplest approach to explaining the growth cycle. But the first one is commitment. You first commit to a specific goal or a future self, 100% commitment. And when you commit, organically from there it goes to courage, because you're committing to something that's up here, whereas your current self is down here. And obviously there's a big gap. If your goals and your situation that you want, your future self is up here, but you're currently just right here, then there's a lack of knowledge, skills, habits, capabilities, resources, maybe network. And so in order to get there, because you've committed 100%, you now have to go through a courage cycle. You've got to courageously start pursuing that, learning it, attempting it, failing it, weeding out old things. The courage cycle ultimately takes you up. And as you go through that courage cycle, that takes you to the 3rd C, which is capability. Through the process of learning, growing, expanding, you then have a new set of capabilities. Capabilities being knowledge, network, habits, skills. You now have a new set of capability that your former self didn't have. Maybe that's making money. Maybe that's having a position. Maybe that's having a platform. Whatever it is, you have a capability that your former self didn't have, which you developed through the courage cycle. Learning new things, trying new things, taking on uncertainty. And that new level of capability leads to the 4th C from Dan, which is confidence. And ultimately, that new level of confidence allows you to commit to bigger and bigger futures that your former self could not even imagine, because imagination is actually the byproduct of confidence. Imagining the future, and by the way, Albert Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. Imagination comes from, in large degree, your current level of confidence. So that's how you go through the cycle. And it really needs to be an approach focus. You want to be approaching what you want rather than avoiding what you don't. And on a daily basis, you can look at your lifestyle, you can look at your behavior, you can look at your habits. How much of what you're doing is just to avoid what you don't want, rather than genuinely focusing on pursuing and approaching what you do? Once you get clear on what you want to spend your time genuinely approaching that thing. And as you approach it, take action towards it, learn more about it, you'll identify with it more, you'll desire it more. And eventually, the old ways of being will stop being desirable to you. And they're not going to stop being desirable simply because you're avoiding them. Instead, they stop being desirable because you've approached and pursued and sought and desired something else. That is how you change your life. It's not about avoiding what you don't want. It's about putting your focus and your energy towards what you do want and then using that as fuel for transforming who you are and what you want. I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy. On this page, you can get the next video that will help you become your future self. Talk to you later.